September 1939, Bay Roberts Fishing Wharf, Newfoundland. The cold spray of the North Atlantic struck against the grey planks of the wharf, while a lone bell buoy echoed through the fog. Newfoundland, still a separate British dominion, felt worlds away from the chaos beginning in Europe. The rumble of distant war reached only as whispers across the wind. Oberleutnant Richter wasn't a fisherman. He was a seasoned German intelligence operative, hidden under the identity of a Swiss biologist collecting marine samples. Standing at the edge of the pier, binoculars in hand, he wasn't watching seabirds. He was scanning for the faint silhouette of a British destroyer or the rising smoke of a U-boat waiting offshore. Richter belonged to a small, scattered Abwehr network stationed across North America, agents charged with charting Allied movements and uncovering weak links in the supply chain carrying American weapons to Britain. Their mission, sabotage. But first came observation, and there was one target of extraordinary importance. A secret airfield known only to a few, the Newfoundland Airport. Built on a boggy plateau near a forgotten rail stop called Gander, it was a project of impossible scale. 4 vast concrete runways carved out of wilderness. Now under Royal Canadian Air Force Command, it had become one of the most crucial yet least known military sites in the Western Hemisphere. Richter's closest contact was a mild-mannered meteorologist near St. John's, who intercepted encrypted transmissions filled with cryptic references. Hudson's cleared, Liberators incoming, Beaver Brook Center active. The patterns hinted at something far beyond routine patrols. Then came a report that changed everything. In November 1940, through a chain of smugglers and neutral couriers, a thin slip of paper reached Berlin. Its author, an old rail worker nicknamed the Coot, described seeing 7 enormous twin-engine aircraft, later identified as Lockheed Hudsons, lifting off from Gander, fully fueled and crewed. They didn't sail for Britain in crates. They flew there. The revelation hit Richter like a blow. The Allies had found a way to leap across the Atlantic itself, bypassing U-boat patrols and the weeks-long sea voyage. This was no transport hub. It was the cradle of a transoceanic lifeline. The RAF Ferry Command had been born. Richter knew how insane the idea sounded, flying directly into winter storms across freezing seas with no navigation beacons. It was supposed to be impossible, suicidal. Yet if 7 planes made it, more would follow. His coded report raced back to Berlin. The Americans have bridged the ocean. Newfoundland is the key junction. By early 1941, within the cold marble corridors of the Abwehr headquarters, Colonel Ulrich Schmidt studied Richter's reports with unease. The supposed stunt flight of 1940 was no longer an anomaly. It was policy. And from the frantic whispers coming out of Montreal, the Ferry Command was expanding into a multinational lifeline, supplying Britain faster than any convoy ever could. Command, the organization, now centered in Montreal, had begun aggressively enlisting civilian pilots, navigators, and radio men from across the Commonwealth, and even the still neutral United States. Their single mission was to keep that improbable aerial bridge alive. Colonel Schmidt bent over the enormous map of the North Atlantic, its surface crisscrossed with red pencil lines showing shipping routes, and the deadly zones where Grand Admiral Dönitz's wolf packs tore Allied convoys apart. But now a new path curved northward, the Great Circle route, offering a far more alarming alternative. By staging through Gander, aircraft could cut the distance sharply, making the crossing achievable for twin-engine bombers that could never have managed it non-stop from the continental mainland. What chilled Schmidt most was the scale of American industry. By mid-1941, the United States was transforming into the arsenal of democracy. New aircraft, B-24 Liberators, Boston's, Hudson's, P-51 Mustangs, were pouring from factories in California and Texas at a pace no intelligence office could fully grasp. Reports now revealed that these planes were being flown, fresh from the assembly line, directly to Canada. and Gander remained the crucial, terrifying choke point. Intercepted signals, increasingly complex in code, described the base's manic rhythm. Once a desolate bog in Newfoundland, Gander had become what Allied crews called the crossroads of the world. Squadron leader David McLean, a weather-beaten Canadian pilot under Ferry Command Chief Arch Gander, saw it firsthand. He stood on the rain-soaked tarmac, the air thick with the tang of high-octane fuel. The runways never slept. 1 hour, a squadron of Hudson bombers, paint still gleaming from the factory, was lined up for departure. The next, a lumbering wave of 4-engine B-24s roared in from the west. Crews staggering out after crossing an entire continent. Massive hangars rose above them, built by American, Canadian, and Newfoundland laborers working side by side. Thousands now lived and worked there. Pilots, mechanics, meteorologists, radio specialists, all focused on one relentless goal: keeping the stream of aircraft moving east. Weather units tracked every front and gale, charting the deadly maze of wind and ice that ruled the North Atlantic. Meanwhile, Richter's newest informant, a humble kitchen worker nicknamed the Spoon, risked his life in the crowded mess halls to count departures. His final transmission, tapped out with shaking hands, reached Berlin weeks later. The movement is not a trickle. It is a flood. 30 to 40 aircraft a day. The runway never empty. Production endless. Schmidt felt the weight of those words. Gander wasn't merely a base. It was a living machine, a transatlantic pump shielded by weather and distance. Germany could neither sink the planes at sea nor strike the factories that built them. Only Gander stood between Allied production and the war front, yet it was untouchable. He crushed the cipher sheet in his fist. Facts, not feelings, were his duty, but the facts were catastrophic. The Allies had found a cure for the U-boat war. The unstoppable torrent of American industry now traveled by air, nullifying Germany's naval advantage. For the first time, Schmidt felt the cold certainty of strategic defeat. Gander had become the funnel through which the arsenal of democracy poured directly into Europe's flames. By spring, in the icy briefing rooms of Berlin, Schmidt faced the High Command. Charts covered the walls, one line marking U-boat sinkings, another the surging arc of ferry command flights. The contrast was stark. Convoys still bled, but aircraft deliveries soared. What once took weeks by sea now crossed the Atlantic in less than 10 hours. Completely beyond the reach of the wolf packs, gentlemen, Schmidt said quietly, tapping the map where Gander sat like a small dot of doom. Our enemy is not Britain alone. Our enemy is North American production. And this place, RCAF Station Gander, is its beating heart. He paused as the room fell silent, the ticking clock echoing louder than the war itself. Agents like Richter and the Spoon. By the end of 1941, thousands of aircraft, among them the first colossal consolidated B-24 Liberator heavy bombers, had already crossed through Gander and landed safely at Prestwick, Scotland. This was no longer an experiment. It was a continuous aerial artery, pumping life into Britain faster than the Luftwaffe could drain it over the channel. The generals gathered around the long oak table understood what air superiority meant. Yet none could truly comprehend the scale of North American industry. Surely the Atlantic winter must halt them, one admiral ventured, invoking the legendary storms that turned the ocean into a death trap. It slows them, yes, Schmidt replied quietly, but it never stops them. He explained how Gander had evolved into the finest weather station on Earth, where Canadian and American meteorologists, many of them hardy Newfoundland locals, could read the moods of the North Atlantic like old sailors. They waited for tiny windows of calm, then gambled, and almost always won. The aircraft departed with only hours of daylight to spare, climbing high above the violent weather that could make even a U-boat captain lose his nerve. Schmidt's gaze swept across the officers. Gentlemen, we are fighting a war of attrition in the air, but the enemy's replacement rate is effectively infinite. Every 3 days, they can replace the entire aircraft losses of the Battle of Britain. Our U-boat campaign has become a tourniquet on an artery that no longer passes through the sea. The Abwehr had examined every dark possibility, parachuting agents near Gander Lake, infiltrating the sprawling barracks, even mounting a daring seaborne strike on its fuel depots. Each plan was discarded. The perimeter was vast, the patrols ruthless, and the wilderness an executioner in its own right. No sabotage team could survive long enough to make a difference. Then, in the spring of 1942, came the most devastating revelation yet. Intelligence confirmed that the Ferry Command was now delivering the four-engine giants, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, across the Atlantic in operational numbers. These weren't mere patrol aircraft. They were the instruments of strategic bombing, capable of striking the industrial heart of Germany itself. Still hiding in the cold shadows of Newfoundland, Klaus Richter compiled the figures with grim precision. The meaning was undeniable. Germany was no longer simply losing the Battle of the Atlantic. It was staring into the future, where its own cities would burn under the wings of bombers born in America and ferried through Canada. The reports were stripped of emotion, but the conclusion was mercilessly clear. The limitless engine of North American production, funneled through the Gander Air Bridge, had made German victory a mathematical impossibility. When Colonel Schmidt presented his final assessment that the Allies had created a reliable, industrial-scale mechanism for transferring strategic air power straight to Britain, effectively nullifying the U-boat war's purpose, the High Command could only sit in silence. The air war had irrevocably tilted toward the Allies, thanks to a base carved from frozen forest in the unforgiving wilds of Newfoundland. RCAF Station Gander. Newfoundland, the war now measured time not in seasons, but in the endless thunder of engines. By 1943, the base had become a city of steel and tarmac, the largest airfield on the planet, its 4 immense runways alive day and night. What began with 7 Lockheed Hudsons had become a ceaseless torrent of aircraft, fuel and manpower, earning Gander its legendary title, the crossroads of the world. Canadian troops now worked beside American crews and thousands of Newfoundland civilians, each cog in a vast logistical organism. The RAF Ferry Command, now absorbed into the Royal Air Force Transport Command, had grown into a precision machine. Not only B-24 Liberators and B-17 Fortresses crossed the ocean now, but every aircraft the Allies could produce, sleek P-51 Mustangs with auxiliary tanks, transport planes laden with engineers, and reconnaissance aircraft carrying high-value cargo. Pilot Officer Jean-Pierre Dubois, a young French-Canadian flying a new B-25 Mitchell, stood in the buzzing briefing room, surrounded by weather charts and exhausted faces. The energy was electric, a mix of nerves, fatigue, and hardened pride. On the walls, maps of the Atlantic showed cold fronts, thunderheads, and lethal icing zones. But by now, the Ferry Command had turned the deadly transatlantic run into a science. The meteorologist pointed to the chart. "Blue yonder route," he said. "High altitude, above the weather, silent across the ocean. We launch in 3 waves, 32 aircraft total." Dubois looked around the room. 32 planes in one day. Every few hours, Gander was sending an entire miniature air force eastward, directly into the collapsing German sky. For the Wehrmacht's intelligence corps, what remained of their reports could only confirm the obvious. The flood had become unstoppable. The increasingly stranded Abwehr network in North America had become a symbol of futility and quiet despair. Colonel Schmidt, reassigned to an obscure administrative office after his unwelcome but accurate warnings, continued tracking the Ferry Command's numbers in secret. By the end of 1943, the total aircraft delivered would surpass 10,000, a number so staggering it seemed unreal. 10,000 bombers and transports, each flown across the lethal Atlantic, represented more than production statistics. They embodied the strategic nightmare Schmidt had foreseen. It proved beyond doubt that Hitler's greatest misjudgment was assuming the Western powers lacked the industrial resolve or logistical genius to unleash their full might. The Gander airfield, carved from rock and forest at the edge of the continent, had neutralized the U-boat war's deadliest advantage. It secured Britain's control of the skies, powered the combined bomber offensive, and ensured the success of the coming Allied invasion of Europe. On the freezing tarmac, Pilot Officer Jean-Pierre Dubois climbed into the cockpit of his B-25 Mitchell. The engines thrummed with restrained fury beneath him. As he looked out over the vast, glowing runways of Gander, he didn't see just an airfield. He saw the living artery of American industry stretching endlessly westward. His bomber, one of thousands, was a piece of an unstoppable tide. The canopy sealed shut, silencing the noise of shouting mechanics. With a nod to the ground crew, Dubois advanced the throttles. The Mitchell surged forward, wheels leaving the earth, soaring into the icy Atlantic darkness. Beneath him lay the invisible bridge of steel and determination that connected two continents, a bridge the Reich could never sever. Its engines thundered across the clouds, carrying destruction toward Europe, and with it, the undeniable truth: the war was lost. The roar that echoed through the night was not merely a sound of flight, it was the sound of inevitability, the proof that Germany could not outlast a nation capable of forging an air bridge across the impossible ocean. Thank you for watching. If the incredible story of Gander and its secret air bridge amazed you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This hidden Canadian marvel reshaped World War II. What do you think? Which aircraft was the true backbone of Ferry Command's success? Share your thoughts in the comments below. That passage you shared is actually the final section of the Gander Ferry Command story. It concludes the entire arc, from Richter's espionage in 1939 to Dubois' flight in 1943, and ends with the reflective narration. Thank you for watching. Epilogue: The Sky After the Storm by 1945. The thunder of departing engines that once defined Gander began to fade into a quieter rhythm. The war was over, and the airfield that had once been a fortress of secrecy transformed almost overnight into a beacon of peace. Where uniformed crews once sprinted through sleet and darkness, now civilian pilots walked casually toward gleaming transports bearing the emblems of Pan Am, BUAC, and Trans-Canada Airlines. Gander, carved out of wilderness for war, had become the beating heart of a new global age, the world's busiest airport, a refueling gateway for every transatlantic journey. The war's impossible bridge had become a bridge for humanity itself. In a small Berlin apartment, years after Germany's surrender, Colonel Ulrich Schmidt lived quietly under denazification review. The same analytical mind that once mapped destruction now studied trade routes and post-war reconstruction plans. He had long accepted the truth he'd predicted, that industrial power, not ideology, had won the war. On his desk, a yellowed clipping from a British newspaper showed a photograph of Gander's bustling peacetime terminal. In the margin, he had written only two words: they learned. Far across the ocean, on the foggy Newfoundland coast, Klaus Richter, long presumed dead, had in fact survived, an aging man living under another name, tending a modest lighthouse near Twillingate. Some said he'd stayed because he fell in love with the place he was sent to spy on. He often stood at dusk, watching passenger planes arc overhead, their silver wings catching the last light. To him, every departing aircraft was a ghost of the war he failed to stop, and a symbol of what came after, the triumph not just of power, but of persistence.